The Chontal Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula region of Mesoamerica have become known to history as the Phoenicians of Mesoamerica. They controlled a number of city-states along the Tabasco River, what we would now call the Grijalva River. They were traders, specializing in cloth and textiles, and they wouldn't be averse to trading with people as far west as the Mexica in Tenochtitlan, especially during moments where the Mexica recently had a conquest and had excess slaves that they needed to dump off. So when the Spanish began landing on the shores of the Yucatan Peninsula in 1517 and 1518, the Chontal Maya are the first people to get a look at them. We said in the last episode that the Chontal people picked up on the beards of the Spanish, especially as a unique characteristic that they focused on, but it wasn't so much what the Spanish looked like that concerned the Chontal Maya. It was what they did. According to some of the Catholic friars that were on these Spanish exploratory missions, the Spanish had been making offers to trade with these Phoenicians of Mesoamerica, and then when boys would come on their ships, they would just kidnap them. These types of kidnappings on exploratory missions may even have been happening before the year 1517. But whatever the case, the Spanish used these kidnapped boys to act as interpreters for them. So in between some bloody skirmishes and some so-called trading negotiations, these interpreters for the Spanish inform the Chontal Maya that the Spanish are looking for gold and food. And if we remember the political situation in Mesoamerica, to the Chontal Maya, gold and food sounds a lot like tribute. Once these Chontal Maya realize this, they proceed to turn around, point straight at Tenochtitlan, and say, "We pay tribute to those guys." Again, pointing straight at the Aztec Empire. This is all the Spanish need to hear, by the way, and they retreat and return in force in 1519. They come with 10 boats, 400 men, horses, steel weapons, armor, guns, all things the Chontal Maya had never seen before. The Spanish sail to Potonchan, a major city to these Maya people, and after the people of the city make it clear that they're not just going to allow the Spanish to come in and do whatever they want, the attack is on. One of the Spanish conquistadors by the name of Bernal Diaz wrote about the first phase of this battle, which involved getting from the Spanish ships safely onto the shore where they could establish a base of operations, essentially an amphibious assault. Diaz, talking about the difficulty that it took to get onto land safely, says, quote, "With great bravery, the locals surrounded us in their canoes, pouring such a shower of arrows on us that they kept us in the water up to our waists. There was so much mud and swamp that we had difficulty getting clear of it, and so many Indians attacked us, hurling their lances and shooting arrows, that it took us a long time to struggle ashore." End quote. Once they got on land, there was some indecisive fighting, and eventually the Spanish figured out that the best way to utilize their advantage, better armor, steel weapons, horses, was to move the fight onto somewhat of an open field, because that way they could mass up their superior armor and weapons and then smash into the opponent. Ultimately, what turned the tide were the Spanish lances and crossbows, the steel weapons, as we mentioned. But in this particular battle, it was the horses, a cavalry charge. At least 10 horses come, and mounted warriors completely decimate any Chontal resistance. And if you don't know much about pre-modern military history, I don't know if it's a perfect analogy, but many people have made the analogy of the horse being the pre-modern tank. First of all, it's massive. Secondly, it moves very quickly. It can be used as an offensive weapon to break enemy lines, quickly maneuvering around or to the side of an opponent. And especially when armored up, a horse charging at you is just terrifying. So even a few of these to people that have never seen a horse before can absolutely turn the tide of a battle. Historian Camilla Townsend talks about the aftermath of this battle outside of Potanchan. She says, quote, "The leaders of Potanchan counted their missing men, whose bodies lay strewn over the field of battle. They had lost over 220 warriors in only a few hours. Nothing comparable had ever occurred in all the histories recorded in stone or legend. They simply could not afford to keep up a fight like that. Even if in the end they could drive these men away, the battle would do them no good, for everyone in their world would learn of it. They would be left weak and defenseless, vulnerable to their enemies, having lost many hundreds of their own. Moreover, it seemed likely that more of these strangers would arrive the following year. So it was that the Chontal sued for peace. One of the enemy, strangely enough, spoke some Yucatan Mayan, a language well known to the Chontal. He had been a prisoner on the peninsula for years. He said that his leader, Cortez, would forgive them if they made amends." End quote. And make amends they did. They submitted to the Spanish, gave them food, tribute, shelter, allowed them to partake in the goods that they had famously traded for as the Phoenicians of Mesoamerica. But maybe most importantly, 20 slave women were gifted to the Spanish as a token of submission. And one of those slave women might have been the greatest gift that the Spanish Empire ever received. But before we get there, we should talk about the baptism of these 20 slave women. They were taken to one of the nearby beaches. A Catholic priest, also known as a friar at this time, dressed up in the full splendor of the Roman Catholic Church, murmured prayers to himself, shouted out absolutions to the crowd, and began the process of giving these women good Catholic names. Spanish soldiers and high-ranking men on the expedition were there. The man who would lead the conquest of the Aztec Empire, Hernando Cortez, was probably there as well. And he ordered that the most beautiful woman of the 20 be given to the highest ranking official, or at least the highest status official that was with this expedition. And we'll get to why Cortez wanted to be impressing the Spanish nobility in a little bit. But this woman would be given the name Dona Marina. To this day, nobody knows what her real name was. The priest sprinkled holy water on her, said the necessary prayers, made the holy gestures, and immediately after this baptism, she was given to this Spanish nobleman to be used for sex. Aside from setting the tone for where this story is going and introducing us to one of the main characters in this story that you probably don't even know about, this story of the baptism of these slave women is tragic on a human level. These people's original towns or city-states were conquered by the Mexica, who promptly sold them into slavery. They had to acclimate to life as slaves in a whole new area, the world of these Chontal Maya. And then they're simply traded away again to a new people who are going to use them as slaves. This newly named woman, Marina, eventually began communicating with another interpreter that the Spanish had under their control, a man by the name of Hernando de Aguilar. And through him, she started to learn the Spanish language. And she also learned the basic idea of the political situation that their leader, Hernando Cortez, was in, and also the history of the Spanish and how they got to the Americas, and a little bit about the situation all the way back in Europe. She learned that Columbus had sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean, landing somewhere in the Caribbean. She probably knew about the Spanish looking to set up trading outposts. She probably knew about the forced labor and the slavery that the Spanish were implementing in these Caribbean islands. She learned about their desire for wealth and glory, their desire to spread their religion as well. And she eventually decides to tell Cortez about the Aztec Empire. And she describes the political situation in Mesoamerica to him. She tells Cortez about the tribute system that the Aztec employed. She tells him about their use of polygyny. And she agrees to act as his interpreter in order to help him with his goals. And I think it's at this point that we can start referring to Dona Marina as what the Mexica people called her, and really what history has infamously named her ever since. Malintzin, or Malintze. The Spanish couldn't pronounce this, so they called her Malinche. So I might oscillate between these two names depending on who she's with in the context of what I'm talking about here. Malintzin when she's with the Mexica, or Malinche when she's with the Spanish. But this woman is one of the great controversial figures in all of history. Many people view her as the ultimate villain, and she is still hated to this day for helping Cortez and the Spanish to conquer the Aztec Empire. She's viewed as a traitor to Mexicans and Native Americans all along North and South America. So her role in this story is controversial to people who think that way. Others of you listening right now might not even know who she is. You might be saying, who the heck is Malinche? Get to the part in the story where Cortez starts conquering things. And that's because for hundreds of years, her role in this story was minimized or even outright ignored. For hundreds of years, as we've said, most people just accepted the Spanish narrative of what happened with this conquest as the Spanish had better weapons and the Aztec people were superstitious, and this allowed the Spanish to conquer them easily. They accepted that narrative at face value. But more modern scholarship, really within the last 40 or 50 years, has uncovered the role that this woman Malinche played in this conquest, and through Malinche's role, it opens up a whole new avenue of insight into what really happened between the Spanish and the Mexica. So she's an incredibly controversial figure. I mean, there's stuff out there that paints Malinche as some sort of witch, a sorceress, again, a traitor to an entire continent. But In her book, Fifth Son, historian Camilla Townsend pumps the brakes on some of these wild narratives about Malinche or Malintzin. And the idea here is that in the modern day, we have to understand why this woman would have decided to help Cortez. Why help the Spanish? Especially if she was getting a sense for what they were really after. And after the attack on Potonchan and ensuing events that we're going to get to, there's no doubt that Malintzin knew what was going on here. So again, why help? Camilla Townsend says that, first of all, we need to remember that Malintzin probably had a significant resentment of the Mexica. Remember, it was the Aztec or the Mexica who sold her into slavery in the first place. So she was already familiar with slavery, and being slave to a new people may not have been as much of a shock as we in the modern day think it would have been. And she was almost certainly used for sex with the Chontal Maya, and it's reasonable to believe that she had built up a resentment towards the Aztec Empire. Next, she might have been operating out of a mere sense of practicality. Maybe if she helps the Spanish and gets them where they want to go, she won't have to be a sex slave anymore. And I find it hard to believe that any of us in the same situation wouldn't have made the same choice. It's also very possible and even likely, given her actions that we're going to be talking about in the very near future here, but it's possible that Malintzin was operating out of a sense of nobility, and she wanted to genuinely make peace between the Spanish and, if not the Aztec, then at least the city-states and the Nahua-speaking peoples that were originally her hometown and the surrounding area. Maybe she wanted to prevent large-scale war from decimating her people, and she felt that interpreting for Cortez might have been the best way to do this. And finally, Camilla Townsend makes the very important point that when thinking about Malintzin, we have to be careful not to put modern narratives into her story. So in the modern day, she is often hated for betraying Native Americans or the indigenous population of Mexico in the face of the Spanish colonizers, right? But as Camilla Townsend points out, the whole idea of Native American or indigenous, these things wouldn't have made any sense to Malintzin at the time. To Malintzin and the people of Mesoamerica, there was simply the Mexica and the people that they exacted tribute from. So this concept of a us people here and a them people from across the sea, this dichotomy of colonizers and colonized is not immediately obvious for the people at the time, at least not to Malintzin at the beginning of this story. All that being said, if Malintzin was never there, Cortez probably would have found someone that could negotiate and translate for him at a reasonable and decent level. That might have been true, but clearly Malintzin was an incredible person. She had skills and specific characteristics that made her uniquely suited to be the perfect weapon in the hands of someone like Cortez. When we think about weapons, we first think about steel and cannons and guns, maybe even horses, like we mentioned. And again, for hundreds of years in this history, those were the only mentions of weapons in the story. But how about language as a weapon and language as the conduit to power? Malinche had a special gift for language. She learned Spanish in mere months, so quickly, in fact, that the interpreter that was teaching her Spanish eventually got replaced by her. The Mexica who interacted with her all had tremendous respect for her. Pretty much every Spaniard who mentions her in their history has respect and admiration for her. They even gave her the title of Dona Marina. And I should have mentioned that earlier. She wasn't initially given that title. She was bestowed that through her actions. Camilla Townsend says, quote, "Within days, the Spaniards were calling her Dona Marina, a title reserved for high-born ladies in Europe. Over the months to come, she proved herself to be both courageous and charming. She even managed to laugh at times." End quote. Again, all you need to know is that she learned an entire language within a few months, and that gives us insight into the fact that this was a formidable and impressive person. As we're going to see, without Malinche, the Spanish would not have succeeded in conquering the Aztec Empire. So to me, it makes sense to discuss her a little bit and try to understand where she was coming from before we get to the next figure in the story that we need to discuss, who we've only mentioned briefly so far, Hernando Cortez. And the first thing to understand about Hernando Cortez in relation to the story is that in 1519, Hernando Cortez was a renegade outlaw. He was illegally in Mexico to begin with, and everything that he does has to include this bit of information as the background to it to understand why he's doing what he's doing. If we back up a little bit, we remember that Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in 1492. By 1519, less than 30 years later, the Spanish had planted the flag of their king and queen all over the islands of the Caribbean and essentially claimed it as their own. We're going to talk in later episodes about their justifications for doing this and the civilizing mission, the colonial mission. But for now, we should understand that they had a governor in the Caribbean, someone who was in charge of all Spanish operations, and he was dealing with the types of problems that you might imagine a governor of a newly colonized area to be dealing with. Poor relations with the natives, disease, trying to massage reports heading back to the mainland of Spain of the horrible mistreatment of these people who had already existed on these islands. And this governor of the Caribbean finds himself with 400 landless men that he doesn't know what to do with. Luckily, he had been sending out these exploratory missions to the mainland continent out west, which they knew was a thing. And he assigns Hernando Cortez as the leader of this exploratory expedition. And when I'm saying exploratory expedition, you should absolutely imagine me using finger quotes there. Cortez's goal was absolutely gold and goods. But at the last second, the governor panicked and he revoked the assignment from Cortez, probably because he didn't trust Cortez and probably because he was worried that Cortez might cut him out of the profits. Cortez had a legal background, and even the Spanish viewed him as very cunning and, to some extent, weaselly. So the governor revokes the assignment from Cortez, but the messenger that he sends to Cortez to inform him that he's no longer going on this expedition, Cortez just bribes him. And he says, hey, come along on this mission with us and you'll get some of the loot. And Cortez, from there on out, pretends that he never heard that he was no longer legally in charge of this mission. From there, he's off to Mexico, probably viewed as a renegade by the governor of this Spanish Caribbean. And it's make or break for Cortez. If he doesn't come up with significant loot, significant goods, maybe trade relations, and a way to make the empire extremely wealthy, he's going to go back to Spain in chains. Furthermore, we have to remember that this mission Cortez was on was quote-unquote exploratory only. Cortez only had a permit to explore, not to conquer or get rich himself or take slaves or establish an empire or anything like that. So Cortez was very much in a legal bind where his goal is absolutely to conquer Tenochtitlan or at least trade for magnificent gold and goods. But he has to figure out a way to do this legally so that he doesn't get arrested. And Cortez is constantly worried about this. Again, especially if he goes home empty-handed, if he has nothing to show for what he's done in ignoring that revoked permit to explore, he's going to be in huge trouble when he goes back to Spain. So like we said, he was trained in legal practice, and he used this to his advantage. Every document that he writes, every letter he sends home, we have to remember that he's building a legal case for why he's in Mexico, why he should be in charge of this expedition, and why his conquest of the Aztec Empire is not only legal, but necessary. So instead of just taking Cortez's letters and documents at face value, we have to remember this about Cortez when we read his letters or when we try to understand his motivations. Historian Inga Clendenin puts this well, I think, saying, quote, "His letters are splendid fictions, marked by political elisions, omissions, inventions, and transparent desire to impress Charles of Spain with his own indispensability." End quote. We have to keep all of this in mind when we read Cortez's documents and when we assess his actions later on in history. With the help of Malintzin and with knowledge that he has gained now from subduing some of the city-states of the Chontal Maya and the surrounding areas, Cortez now knows about the Aztec Empire. He knows about their general political situation. He knows about their emperor, Moctezuma. And as Cortez is sailing along rivers and also moving across land, moving west towards Tenochtitlan, he begins to encounter the messengers of Moctezuma, the diplomats, we might say. Despite many histories over time that have depicted Moctezuma as a fool and as someone who was meek and cowardly, Moctezuma was not a fool. He had emissaries, he had scouts, he had war councils, and he probably knew more about the Spanish than the Spanish knew about him. Historian Camila Townsend says that when Moctezuma and Cortez end up meeting, Moctezuma is already familiar with some of the Spanish sermons and prayers, and it indicates the detail and the extent to which his scouting operations were expanding outward. So Cortez, through Malintzin, is telling these messengers, "I want you to take us to Tenochtitlan." The Aztec emissaries are stalling, and they don't necessarily want to bring Cortez and this fairly massive army into Aztec territory, much less walking them right up the causeway across the lake onto the island of Tenochtitlan. So with a diplomatic stalemate going on, Cortez formulates a plan. First things first, Cortez has to stay legal. he has to stay above board, remember? And there's a little trick in Spanish common law at this time that says something along the lines that if you are a town, a small scale town, and you get together and you form a charter and you have a document that everybody signs, this gives Spanish legitimacy. And if the citizens of that town agree on a leader who acts in their interests, this is now a legal proceeding. So Cortez essentially founds the town of Veracruz, which is still there, by the way, out of nowhere. He gets a document that all of the men sign together saying that he's the leader, he's going to act in their interests, and he got them all to say that the plan was to go to Tenochtitlan. That was what the citizenry wanted. Before he heads there, he takes care of his back end as well. Remember that high-ranking status guy that Malintzin was given to? Cortez sends him on a mission back to Spain to talk to the king and to advocate for Cortez against that Caribbean governor who was probably talking all kinds of trash about Cortez. So maybe now he'll score some brownie points with the king, and he also scores the added benefit of getting rid of Malinche's Spanish partner, owner, whatever you want to call it, and now he has Dona Marina all to himself. Cortez then beaches any of the ships that he's going to remain left behind, and this ensures that no disgruntled members of his group will abandon him and sail back to the Caribbean. From there, Cortez was going to use the political situation of the Aztec Empire that he learned from Malinche against the Aztec. The plan was a simple one: leave a small force behind to guard his rear, and then march into the heart of the Aztec Empire and turn the towns and city-states that paid tribute to the Aztec against them. From there, use those areas as a base to have supplies and get support. And the first place Cortez heads, probably on advice from Malinche, is Tlaxcala. Remember the Flower Wars? It turns out the Tlaxcalans are less than enthused to be conquered by anyone, much less these newcomers on the scene. And so initial skirmishes between the Tlaxcalans and the Spanish give way eventually to serious battles. There is a feeling out process here, and eventually Cortez learns a lesson. Keep armored men in big groups or columns and use steel armor and weapons and eventually guns to effect. And as long as you maintain these bigger groups and columns, you're going to overwhelm a technologically inferior opponent. And that's a pretty well-known tactic that the Spanish use in this war. But another thing they do that's lesser known is he attacks at night. Often Cortez will use mounted warriors in surprise night attacks to terrorize enemy villages, butcher civilians, spread fear amongst the civilian population of the enemy, and just like that, fade back into the darkness of the night. And so the outskirts of Tlaxcala never knew when they were going to be hit or from what direction. So there's a little bit of this guerrilla warfare element to what the Spanish are up to here. And of course, that's mixed with brutality. Cortez, by his own admission in his own writings, and corroborated many other places, is burning villages. He's torturing emissaries of Tlaxcala. He's cutting the fingers off of some of them and sending them back as warning. He's doing those night attacks that we talked about. Ultimately, the Spanish killed dozens of Tlaxcalans while only losing a single man. Malintzin would play a big role in convincing the Tlaxacalans to sue for peace. And eventually they did. They offered women to the Spanish in return for peace, but also an alliance against the Aztec. Cortez got 1,000 Tlaxcalan warriors on top of his 400 Spanish. He was now headed to Tenochtitlan with conquest in mind. And remember that the Tlaxcalans hated the Mexica worse than they hated the Spanish. Moctezuma, at this point, must certainly have realized that he was in huge trouble. A technologically superior foe, now allied with your greatest enemy, after having a string of victories against local villages and city-states, is headed directly to Tenochtitlan. On the way to Tenochtitlan, the Spanish absolutely decimate the city-state of Cholula. Temples were burned, bodies desecrated, victims strewn all over the place. Historians debate whether or not Moctezuma ordered the city-state of Cholula to resist the Spanish, or if the Spanish just did it for fun, or if it was some sort of Tlaxcalan trick to make the Aztec look bad. But whatever the case, at this point, Moctezuma agrees to offer the Spanish tribute on a massive scale that he was very reluctant to offer before. Again, the Spanish and the Tlaxcalans had now had another victory, and Moctezuma couldn't really afford a battle. It would make him look weak, and in the political environment of the central Mexican basin, that's the one thing you can't do, is look weak. And you certainly can't lose a battle right outside of Tenochtitlan, or you're done. Some historians have painted Moctezuma as weak for this offer of tribute and cowardly maybe, but the more modern scholarship says that he was just acting out of practicality. He couldn't afford to lose a battle, potentially that he knew in the back of his head they were going to lose. So whatever the case, the Spanish and the Tlaxcalans reject the offer of tribute. Again, they destroy Cholula and they march right to Tenochtitlan. Remember that there's a land bridge that connects the island of Tenochtitlan with the rest of the central Mexico basin, and the Spanish with their army and the Tlaxcalans march right up the main causeway. Moctezuma has only one choice at this point, and that's to meet Cortez at the end of the causeway as an equal. Bernal Diaz, who we've cited before in this podcast and was with the Spanish, one of the so-called conquistadors, later in his life wrote about what he remembered about what must have been a completely surreal moment. Literally, two representatives of clashing civilizations meeting at the end of this majestic causeway at the foot of the beautiful city of Tenochtitlan, in the midst of war and conquest and death. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Diaz was surprised what a great impression the city of Tenochtitlan made. He said, quote, "These great towns and pyramids and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. Amadis was a legendary knight, and a book about him had recently become a bestseller in Spain. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked if it were not all a dream. Large canoes could come into the garden pond from the lake through a channel they had cut. Everything was shining with lime and decorated with different kinds of stonework and paintings, which were a marvel to gaze on. I stood looking at it and thought that no land like it would ever be discovered in the whole world." End quote. Diaz here, again, painting this incredible picture of Moctezuma, the emperor of this incredible Aztec Empire, waiting at the end of the causeway in the shadow of this majestic city of Tenochtitlan with its ponds and the lake and the gardens and the flowers and the birds and the colors, the pyramids, the temples. Diaz had never seen anything like it. And you have this Spanish army armor probably glinting in the sunlight, Cortez at their head, marching right towards Moctezuma. We will pick up the story from there, but I like the way that historian Camila Townsend talks about this citation from Bernal Diaz. She says, quote, Bernal Diaz was writing these words as an old man. He had reason to feel a bit maudlin as he thought of his lost youth and then also recalled all that had happened since. At the end of that paragraph, he almost visibly flinched with shame. Citing Diaz now, quote, Today, all that I then saw is overthrown and destroyed. Nothing is left standing. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.